All right. All right. Welcome to our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, June 9th. Today we have Bill Lamb is coming back. Bill had previously spoke about the New York Giant ownership. Now he's going to complete that from John Brush to Horace Stoneham. And then later on in the year, we'll have Rob Garrett do the ownership of the Giants from Stoneham until present day Giants. So next week we will have Marty Appel. Marty is, a huge baseball guy with the Yankees, and he wrote a great autobiography on Casey Stengel. And he'll be discussing Casey Stengel, learned everything from John McGraw, played for the Giants. So he's going to talk about his time with the Giants and his managerial in the minor leagues, and then with the Yankees, and then later on with the Mets. Before we get started, Karen, are you available? This is Karen Marco. Karen is an author.
Hello.
And
I muted myself.
I'm sorry?
I had muted am I muted?
No, you're good. Karen, why don't you tell us what's going on with your book? What's it about? And you'll be speaking later on in the year to our group if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, the book is about Eddie Grant. And it's a biography, but it's also a social history of Eddie Grant and World War I and segregation in the two great institutions at the time, the military and baseball. I'm a social historian. Right now it's at the Designer. The book is finished. And after the Designer, it goes to the printer. And if we have enough paper and it's not on a ship somewhere coming from China, I hope the book will be out during the summer.
And of course, you all know that the Grant had the monument in the Polo Grounds that disappeared and is somewhere that nobody knows. It's
somewhere. And I have a chapter on that too, the mystery of that.
Wonderful. So we'll look forward to hearing from you in a future date, Karen, okay?
Okay, I'll let y'all stay in touch, Gary. Thank you.
Perfect. Without further ado, then I'd like to turn over again to a great Giants historian, Bill Lamb. Bill, do you want me to share the screen now, or you want to do a little talk before? Talk to me.
Gary, just you can put me on, and then if you would post the screens, the slides as I cue you.
Absolutely. So let me get that ready for you. Share. Okay. Let's see. I think this is the one.
That's the first one right there.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, Bill, the floor is yours. Welcome back.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate being invited back, and thank you for that. And I also thank those of you who are tuning in, particularly those of you who were with us in April and decided to come back for more punishment tonight. As Gary might have mentioned, in April, I covered the Giants from the founding of the club in 1883 through the transfer of the franchise to John T. Brush in September 1902. Tonight, I intend to cover the four Giant ownership groups that carried the club through the 1957 season and the abandonment of New York. But I think it would be helpful to bring those of you who weren't with us the first time up to speed via a brief recap of the Giant origins pre-Brush. So just to remind you that, the Giants were founded in 1883 as a new entry into the National League. The franchise was financed by John B. Day, a tobacco product manufacturer originally from Connecticut, and an amateur baseball enthusiast and a player himself. That is a photograph of a Day taken around 1890. They're hard to come by. I know of only one other. Officially, the Giants were operated by the Metropolitan Exhibition Company, which was Day's corporate alter ego. They were actually the second of two major league clubs controlled by Day, the other being the Metropolitan of New York Club, the original New York Mets. The Giants played middle of the pack baseball in their first several seasons, drawing no particular acclaim, while the Mets performed well at the American Association, which was the rival major league of the time, capturing the 1884 pennant. But the Mets were sold off in 1885 so that Day and his cohort could focus their attentions exclusively on the Giants. And immediately thereafter, the club succeeded both on the field and at the turnstiles, with the Giants setting attendance records at the gate and winning consecutive National League pennants and World Series over AA opposition in 1888 and 1889. During the late 1880s, two threats to franchise prosperity surfaced. The first cost the club its playing field. The original Polo Grounds, located at 110th Street and Central Park North, they were demolished to make way for a city street over the winter of 1888-1889. In time, however, Day was able to lease suitable new grounds in very far north Manhattan and finished the 1889 season in a new wooden ballpark named the New Polo Grounds. The more ominous threat to the franchise took the form of the Players League of 1890. As most of you know, the Players League was conceived by the Giants star shortstop, John Montgomery Ward, and the New York franchise was stocked with the cream of the Giants: Buck Ewing, Roger Connor, Tim Keefe, Jim O'Rourke, and other Giant stalwarts. The franchise was underwritten by a trio of well-heeled local businessmen: Wall Street financier Edward Baker Talcott, tobacco baron Edward McAlpin, and stockbroker Frank B. Robinson, about whom I know very little except that he was reputedly McAlpin's brother-in-law. Gary, if you could put up that second. There they are. That's Talcott and McAlpin on the top. Beneath them is Cornelius Van Cott, the former Postmaster General of New York, who was who came from a baseball family but had very little interest in baseball himself, but was installed as a figurehead as club president. Behind the scenes, Talcott was the guy who ran the show. The competition between Players League and National League teams was cutthroat, but no more was it more vigorous than in New York, where the Talcott group erected their ballpark right next door to the Polo Ground. Gary, if you could flash that other next screen up. Some of you may recall this from last time. This is a photograph that I took, or a drawing rather, that I took from Stu Thornley's excellent book on the Polo Grounds. The one marked Manhattan Field on the lower side, that's actually the new Polo Grounds. It was called the Manhattan Field in the 1890s. Above that is Brotherhood Park, which provides the footprint for the stadium we will know as the Polo Grounds, or Polo Grounds 4. These ballparks were separated by no more than a 10-foot wide alley and the stadium walls. And the National League, for reasons difficult to fathom now, decided to schedule all their games directly opposite their Players League opposition so that the fans would have to make a choice. And for the most part, they chose the Players League team. This created a financial drain on the Giants, the National League Giant coffers, that were accompanied by reversals in John B. Day's business fortunes. And the consequences were quick and dire. As a matter of fact, at a clandestine meeting conducted in July, National League owners were astonished to learn that the Giants, their cornerstone franchise in the nation's largest city, was on the verge of bankruptcy. And it was only an infusion of cash by other National League owners, led by A.G. Spaulding of Chicago, that allowed the Giants to finish the season. By the end of the 1890 season, organized baseball is in dire straits. There simply is not enough revenue to go around for 3 major leagues to survive. You remember, you have the National League, this new Players League, and you also have the American Association, which has franchises in most of the major eastern cities. Before the 1890 season even finished, John B. Day for the National League Giants and Edward Talcott for the Players League Giants already began merger negotiations to combine their 2 clubs. And in due course, that was achieved. The Players League folded after a single season, and the Giants returned to the National League under the auspices of John B. Day, still as president, but in fact controlled by the Talcott Group, who were much more financially secure. They ran the club behind the scenes. And in February 1893, John B. Day resigned and left the game. This allowed Talcott to reinstall Venkata as the figurehead president and for him to continue running the team behind the scenes. The Giants' fortunes picked up in the early 1890s under Talcott, who was an astute baseball man, but also, unlike Day, he was not in it for the love of the game. He was a businessman, and he expected a return on his investment. And he became dissatisfied with the money he was putting into the club and the puny returns he was getting. So by the 1894 season, he's looking to get out. And he strong arms his associates, particularly Frank Robinson, into going along. In January of 1895, Talcott is able to muster a working majority of the Giants' stock into the hands of Andrew Friedman. If you could put the next slide up, Gary. There's Friedman. Friedman is young. He's only 34. He's a native New Yorker, born in Manhattan, and he is wealthy. He is indeed the wealthiest of all the National League owners. As a matter of fact, Blanche McGraw said he had more money than all the other National League owners put together. He's a very astute businessman, a political insider with the Democratic Party, but he is not a baseball man. To him, baseball is a diversion. He's a dilettante. It's like collecting French landscape painting or opera patronage or yachting or his other pastimes. It's something that he indulged in to take his mind off the very weighty business and political affairs that really dominated his life. Worse yet, he was temperamentally ill-suited for baseball. He was a very proud man, quick-tempered, very thin-skinned, sensitive to slights, particularly of an anti-Semitic nature, and vindictive. And in time, he came into conflict with virtually everyone, his players, the umpires, the league hierarchy, his fellow owners, and particularly the New York City sporting press, all of whom had rather intense dislike of him. The 8 seasons of the Friedman regime were the worst in New York Giants history. During that time, he hired and fired about 13 managers and alternated interference in club affairs with long periods of total indifference to the Giants. The one season in 8 that the Giants were a contender, 1897, Friedman spent that summer in Europe, attending to various political and social events. Once he got back, the team resumed its losing ways. By 1900, 1901, 1902, baseball is losing its charm for Friedman. He dislikes the frequent criticism he receives in the press. He's unhappy with the performance of his club, and he's now consumed by other projects, particularly the construction of the New York City subway. Although Friedman has been pilloried in baseball literature, he was a man of real competence in other fields. And when he died in 1915, the New York Times said he was more responsible than any other man in the city for the construction of the New York City subway. But as a baseball owner, he was little short of a disaster. Curiously, toward the end of his time with the Giants, he entered into an improbable alliance with John T. Brush, a longtime Friedman adversary who owned the Cincinnati Reds. He and Brush combined on various schemes that generally had the baseball world in uproar, including the baseball trust scheme, the gutting of the Baltimore Orioles, and various other misadventures. But by the end of the 1902 season, Friedman is preoccupied with the subway project. He wants to get out. Brush is on hand, although they're not friends in a personal sense. They have a cordial working relationship. And Brush sells the Reds in order to finance the purchase of the Giants from Friedman. And that's where we stand as John T. Brush enters the picture. And that hopefully is a brief recap that'll bring everybody who wasn't here last week, or last time rather, up to speed. So now to John T. Brush and what I call a decade of New York Giants success. There is John T. At about 1905, when he no longer had the handlebar mustache that gave him such a sinister appearance. If you saw Brush in the 1880s, he's a very sinister looking guy. I mean, if he had a top hat and a cape, he'd be the perfect silent movie villain. You could just see him tying a little Nell to the railroad tracks. But that's him in 1905 when he is in his heyday with the Giants. The two other guys are a young John McGraw on the bottom left, and Ashley Lloyd is the person on the bottom right, who is Brush's junior partner, and I'll discuss him in a minute. But Brush himself was the principal owner of the New York Giants from September 1902 until his death in November 1912. And the decade of the Brush regime was one of effective and stable administration of the front office, 4 National League pennants and a World Series title on the field, and remarkable growth in home attendance. And when a fire destroyed much of the Polo Grounds in April 1911, Brush, although he's clearly in failing health, undertook the 6-figure ballpark rebuild that yielded the iconic bathtub-shaped Polo Grounds that those of our generation remember. While obviously this is a subjective opinion and it's entirely my own, John T. Brush, in my opinion, was easily the best owner the New York Giants ever had. Brush is a fascinating character. He's born in upstate New York in 1845, and he is the ultimate self-made man. His father died before he was born, and his mother passed away when he was 4, leaving he and his 3 older siblings to be raised by a rather severe paternal grandfather. He and his older brother George were made to sleep in an unheated barn and spent most of their days toiling in the field on the Brush farm. He escaped from this kind of rural drudgery as a teenager, and after a brief stint in art school, he enlisted in the Union Army and saw actual frontline duty with a New York artillery regiment in the Civil War. After that, he found employment in the retail clothing trade in upstate New York, where he progressed from being a salesman to a store manager to a partner in a rather prosperous retail clothing firm. By 1875, Brush has relocated to Indianapolis, where he is the owner-proprietor of a large department store, reputedly the largest of its kind between New York and Chicago, and successful. Originally, Brush seized upon baseball as a vehicle for advertising this department store, but he soon became infatuated with the game. He went from organizing local amateur clubs and building playing fields to backing the Indianapolis entry in the Minor Western League in 1885. And then in 1887, he is the guy who spearheads an effort by Indianapolis businessmen to spirit away the St. Louis Maroons franchise of the National League and relocate it to Indianapolis. In time, Brush serves as the vice president and then president of the Indianapolis Hoosiers, a National League franchise, for 3 seasons in the late 1880s. At the same time, he is the owner of the premier Western League franchise, also called the Indianapolis Hoosiers. Brush is distraught when the National League decides to liquidate his franchise as a preemptive measure in the run-up to the Players League War of 1890. And he extracts various promises from his fellow owners, which include the right to the first franchise that becomes available, which in 1891 is Cincinnati. And Brush muscles his way past the other claimants to take control of that National League team. He runs the team from 1891 through the 1902 season in conjunction with Ashley Lloyd, the other fellow in this photograph. Lloyd is a member of a prominent Cincinnati family. He is a druggist or a pharmacist by trade, and he and his brothers own a chain of very prosperous drugstores in the Midwest. He and Brush raised the funds necessary to procure the Giants franchise from Andrew Friedman in 1902. Lloyd will continue to serve as a confidant and a trusted advisor of Brush, and frequently will be the Giants representative at National League meetings when Brush's fragile health will not permit him to attend. Lloyd will also serve as the Giants club treasurer throughout the Brush years and thereafter. A larger and obviously more visible contributor to the Giants' success during the Brush years was young John McGraw. He and Brush are an interesting pair. They are separated by a generation in age, but both are the spawn of rural poverty in upstate New York. They come to hold each other in high regard, and they work seamlessly to put a championship ball club on the field. Brush deferred to McGraw's expertise regarding playing talent and left him free to acquire whomever was needed to bolster the Giants roster. Given that free reign, McGraw in very short order transforms a cellar-dwelling 1902 Giants team that he takes over while Friedman is still the owner, and within 2 seasons elevates them to the National League Championship in 1904. That team had 3 future Hall of Famers, Christy Mathewson, Joe McGinnity, and Roger Bresnahan, plus 2 near Cooperstown worthy players in outfielder Mike Donlin and shortstop Bill Dalen. And they were clearly the class of Major League Baseball in 1904. But that season ended in recrimination rather than celebration when the Giants refused to participate in the newly inaugurated postseason World Series between the National League and American League champions. Brush and McGraw offered various excuses for the Giants' refusal to meet the Boston Pilgrims, but the real reasons were likely these. First, mutual Brush and McGraw animosity toward American League president Ban Johnson. Brush's grievances against Johnson dated back to when Cincinnati sports editor Johnson had lambasted Brush's administration of the Reds, and then escalated when Johnson became the Western League president in 1893 and frequently clashed with Hoosiers club owner Brush. McGraw had fallen out with Johnson in 1902 when McGraw managed the Baltimore Orioles and chafed under the disciplinary measures imposed by American League President Johnson. McGraw also suspected that Johnson intended to squeeze him out when the Baltimore franchise was relocated to New York, as was widely expected as the 1902 season progressed. In any event, the second and perhaps the most telling reason why Brush and McGraw refused to play the 1904 World Series was dread at the prospect of having to play the New York Highlanders, eliminated from AL pennant contention on the next to last day of the season. Brush had bitterly resisted the relocation of the Orioles franchise to New York City in 1903, but had been overruled by his fellow owners, and both he and McGraw despised the team in Hilltop Park and wanted no way of acknowledging them, particularly playing them in a World Series. The near universal scorn for the position they took in 1904 prompted a change of heart the following season when the Giants repeated as the National League champions. This time, the Giants rarely agreed to take on the American League pennant winning Philadelphia A's, and then basked in that's the famous 5 all shutout game World Series victory of the Giants, which incidentally was played under World Series rules devised largely by Brush that remain, for the most part, in effect to this day. Now, the Giants are going to remain competitive from that point on, but they're not going to win another pennant until 1911. Nevertheless, the attendance of the Polo Grounds keeps climbing, and in 1908, the Giants draw a new Major League record of 910,000 paid admissions. In the front office, on the field, and at the gate, the franchise is doing great. But unfortunately, by this time, John T. Brush's health is in precipitous decline. He long suffered from locomotor ataxia, which is a very painful wasting disorder, and now he was mostly confined to a wheelchair. Then with his end, he could see his end in sight. Disaster in the form of an early morning fire in April 1911 largely destroys the wooden version of the Polo Grounds. But with his family's approval, Brush encouraged the $100,000 plus cost of rebuilding the stadium, which then is transformed into the concrete and steel edifice that we remember as Polo Grounds today. Gary, if you could flash the next slide. That's a picture of the Polo Grounds. I think it's taken during the 1913 World Series. And there is a schematic of the dimensions of the park that I'm sure many of us remember. If you see section 10 outlined in the little red there, I put that there because that's where I saw my first Giants game. My dad took me there in 1953. We were so close to Don Mueller that if I had 10-foot arms, I could reach down and took off his hat. But there it is. You know, it's peculiar glory. The Giants won pennants in 1911 and 1912, but lost the World Series both years, 1912 being a particular heartbreaker. But shortly after the 1912 series ended, a physically frail John T. Brush convened a meeting of the National Exhibition Company. This was his corporate alter ego. When John B. Day had the Metropolitan Exhibition Company, thereafter, the Giants were incorporated in New Jersey as the National Exhibition Company. And at this meeting, it was determined that Brush's son-in-law, Harry Hempstead, who had been a member of the NEC board since 1903, was designated as Brush's successor in waiting. Gary, if you could put the next slide up. No, there's one before that, I think.
I don't think so, but let's see. Nope.
No, then folks, we've lost Harry Hempstead.
Is that him? That's
There
it.
he is. There's Harry. I sent you them in the wrong order. My apologies.
Okay, no problem. I'll go back after this one.
Okay. That's Harry Hempstead. Although he was unknown to the baseball public and the sporting press, he wasn't a stranger to baseball. Hempstead was actually a ball player himself. He played outfield for his prep school team and for the class 9 at Lafayette College when he was an undergraduate. And he'd been a member of the National Exhibition Company Board since 1903. So he knew the operation, even if the baseball world didn't know him. It would not take long for him to have to take over. In November 1912, Brush boarded his private rail car for a restorative health trip to the sunny and warm West Coast, but he never made it. He died in his rail car out in Missouri at age 67. His funeral was a real affair. Even Ban Johnson made an appearance. They had buried the hatchet prior to the 1912 World Series. But the most grief-stricken of all the mourners was John McGraw, who was a pallbearer and described John T. Brush as the gamest, bravest man who ever lived. He would not have that same relationship with Harry Hempstead. The executors of the Brush estate were Hempstead and Brush friend and business junior partner Ashley Lloyd. The deceased majority interest of the Giants was divided equally among his second wife, which is former Broadway ingenue Elsie Lombard Brush. If you could put that other previous photograph up, Gary. That's Elsie on the top left during her salad days on the Broadway stage. In the middle is a picture of Eleanor Brush Hempstead. This is John T. Brush's daughter by his first wife, taken late in her life. She was actually a very nice looking woman, rather than the dowager shown here. And on the bottom is John T. Around 1900 with his younger daughter, Natalie, who was the daughter of John T. and Elsie. Although they owned the team, the franchise was run by Harry Hempstead. And Hempstead was different than Brush. Although he knew baseball, he was not the enthusiast that Brush was. He viewed baseball as a business and his primary responsibility as safeguarding the money of the Brush women. He therefore took a very different attitude toward the Giant revenue situation. And he was particularly alarmed by the downturn in Giants attendance and club revenue that attended the arrival of the Federal League in 1914. And Hempstead was particularly distressed by the World War I driven attendance drop-off to barely 250,000. And that's from 910,000 just 10 years earlier, that the club suffered during the World War I season of 1918. Like I said, Hempstead is a capable executive and an effective one. After all, he oversaw Giant teams that won National League pennants in 1913 and 1917, although the Giants lost the pennant both years. And he was an honest and an honorable man, but a cautious one. When the armistice is signed and peace is declared in Europe in November 1918, Major League Baseball is standing on the cusp of a golden age that will generate unprecedented revenues for the owners of baseball clubs. But Harry Hempstead doesn't see this. All he sees is the downturn the club has recently undergone, and he wants to get the Brush women and their money out of the game. Hempstead's desire to sell the Giants produced a split in the family ranks. Elsie Brush, it's interesting, Elsie Brush, Eleanor Hempstead, and Harry Hempstead are contemporaries, although Elsie is technically Harry Hempstead's mother-in-law. She and he are the same age, and Eleanor is only like a year younger. And their attitudes toward baseball are entirely different. Elsie Brush doesn't know anything about baseball, but she trusts Harry Humstead's judgment, and she's going to go along whatever Harry suggests. And her daughter, Natalie, is going to do whatever Elsie tells her. Harry's wife, Eleanor, however, is an entirely different matter. She's a baseball savvy woman in her own right, and she's fiercely protective of her father's legacy with the Giants. She's not willing to part with her interest in the club. Ashley Lloyd is also not willing to sell his minority share in the Giants stock. Notwithstanding that, combining Elsie and Natalie's holding with his own, Harry Hempstead is able to cobble together a working stock majority necessary to exercise control of the Giants. And in January 1919, it's announced that the New York Giants have been sold. The new majority club owner is Charles A. Stoneham, a Manhattan stock trader known only to Giant fans who read newspaper financial pages or tabloid scandal sheets. Joining Stoneham in management as much junior partners were Frank McQuaid, a Manhattan city magistrate and Tammany Hall insider, and Giants manager John McGraw. There's a good time Charlie Stoneham on top, and there is left to right Frank McQuaid, Charlie Stoneham, and John McGraw around 1919. Over the next dozen years, the Stoneham, McQuaid, McGraw triumvirate would preside over 4 National League pennants and 2 World Series triumphs, most of which was done amidst public recriminations, lawsuits, and fistfights involving the Giants' new leadership team. Charles A. Stoneham is a very, very interesting man. Short, stout, and jolly. He embodied a jazz ace stereotype, if you will. The cutthroat businessman by day and the boozy bon vivant by night. Charlie Stoneham didn't court publicity, but he couldn't seem to avoid it. He followed Brush's lead and left management of the Giants entirely in McGraw's hand and had his checkbook ready whenever McGraw needed it. He left roster decisions entirely up to the Giants manager, and he avoided the locker room and the press whenever he could. But his misadventures in both the boardroom and the bedroom were irresistible to the press, and he was always getting in some sort of a fracas throughout his time at the Giants' helm. He was born and raised in Jersey City. He made his fortune in the stock brokerage business, primarily by trading in the unregulated and highly speculative curb exchange, where wheeling and dealing generated a spate of lawsuits by disgruntled investors against him and his firm. His first wife was Alice Rafter Stoneham, a Jersey City girl like himself. She died in January 1898, 5 days after giving birth to Mary Alice Stoneham. Mary Alice was Horace's older half-sister and the mother of future New York Giants executive and National League president Chub Feeney. Horace was the second son born to Charles Stoneham's 1900 marriage to Hannah McGoldrick. The first of the tabloid scandals of the Stoneham age occurred in 1905 when a neglected Stoneham mistress named Dolly Gray committed suicide in a Manhattan hotel while Charlie was mourning the drowning death of his 4-year-old son, Charles Jr. The boy drowned in the Morris Canal behind the house while playing. More than 30 years later, when Charles Stoneham died in January 1936, it was discovered that Stoneham had another quote-unquote family with a showgirl named Margaret Leonard and had fathered 2 more children, all of whom he had secluded in a Westchester County estate, and which were kept from public view during his lifetime. This and much more is related in a comprehensive bio of Charles A. Stoneham by my friend Rob Garrett that will be published next spring by the University of Nebraska Press. Rob's allowed me to take a sneak look at the manuscript, and it's an outstanding and fascinating story, and I urge you to get it when it comes out. But for our purposes, suffice it to say that Charles A. Stoneham was a real piece of work. Nevertheless, the Stoneham Giants enjoyed great success during their early years, capturing 4 consecutive National League pennants from 1921 through 24, and defeating the Yankees in the World Series of 21 and 22 before losing in 23. Shortly thereafter, however, Stoneham became enmeshed in financial scandals that ultimately led to his indictment on serious criminal charges by both federal and state prosecutors. In time, Stoneham will beat these raps, but his ensuing years will then be plagued by strife with junior partner Frank McQuaid. In 1928, Stoneham engineered McQuaid's removal as a Giants club secretary. A highly publicized McQuaid lawsuit followed, which produced embarrassing revelations about the private behavior of Stoneham, McQuaid, and John McGraw. In the end, a $47,000 verdict in McQuaid's favor was vacated on appeal by New York's highest court, and McQuaid was out. By this time, however, McGraw, and we're talking now in the early 1930s, McGraw is frustrated by his inability to win a pennant since 24, and he's probably suffering from the stomach cancer that's going to claim his life within the next couple of years. So he retires as manager and is replaced by star first baseman Bill Terry, who promptly manages the Giants to a pennant and a World Series victory in 1933. That 33 championship will be Charles Stoneham's last hurrah as New York Giants owner. He's suffering from terminal kidney disease, and he's entrusting more and more responsibilities for running the club and the franchise onto son Horace. By then, Horace had been learning the ropes, from helping the grounds crew to working with the ticket office, with accompanying the road secretary for almost a decade. So when Charles dies in January 1936, the Giants transition smoothly to a new president, 32-year-old Horace Charles Stoneham, the youngest club president in Major League history to this day, I think. Getting back to his father, in terms of moral character, Charles A. Stoneham, serial philanderer, shady stock speculator, and quasi-bigamist, was easily the worst person ever to own the New York Giants. But strictly as a ball club owner, he was a straight shooter. His conduct was fair and above board with his players, his fellow owners, and the game itself. And with 5 National League pennants and 3 World Series triumphs, the 17-season regime of Charles A. Stoneham was the most successful in New York Giants history. Now, if we could have a slide of Horace. There's Horace shortly after he assumed the club presidency in 1936. His father's will equally divided control of the club between Mary Alice, his daughter, and Horace, his surviving son. For the next 4 decades, Mary Alice would defer to her younger half-brother and leave running the ball club to him, and years later, her son, Chub Feeney, as I mentioned previously, would become a front office executive with the Giants. But shortly after Horace took control, Charlie's pseudo-wife, Margaret Leonard, instituted litigation on behalf of the 2 children she had borne Horace's father. Happily for baseball, Leonard did not contest the will bequest of the Giants franchise to Horace and Mary Alice, and did not intrude upon the stewardship of the ball club. So Horace would guide the franchise unmolested for the remainder of its time in New York. Horace Charles Stoneham's tenure as Giants owner is comprehensively covered in Steve Treater's new book, 40 Years a Giant, which I'm going to put up here on, if you can see that. It's an excellent and comprehensive biography, which I'm sure many of you have already read. Given the availability of Steve's book and your familiarity, I suspect, with it, I'm going to keep my comments to on Horace short. Some 22 years after he took the reins, Horace did something once unimaginable. He removed New York City's oldest professional sports franchise 300 miles away to San Francisco. And some New York Giant fans, including this one, never forgave him for it. But over time, I and others have come to appreciate the circumstances that prompted the move. When Horace inherited the club in January 1936, the Giants' situation was financially stable. More fans saw games in the Polo Grounds than any other National League club during the mid-1930s. And the Giants under manager Bill Terry were competitive on the field. Indeed, in Horace's first 2 years, the Giants won the National League pennant, only to lose the World Series both years to the Yankees. Thereafter, the Giants would go penniless for 13 seasons. When Terry resigned as manager after the 41 season, Horace replaced him with longtime Giants outfielder and fan favorite Mel Ott. And Horace himself began taking a more active role in club management, becoming in effect the team's general manager, although he never assumed that title for himself. But acting in that capacity, Horace was often criticized for a sentimental attachment to veteran players who should have been gotten rid of. And he also continued his father's policy of larding the club payroll with Stoneham relatives. On the plus side, Horace put the Giants in the vanguard of the major league clubs relocating to Arizona for spring training. He was, I think, the first New York club boss to sign a television contract for the team after World War II. And most important, he quickly integrated the Giants. Once, of course, Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers had broken the color line. Revitalization of Giants' fortunes coincided with the arrival of black standouts like Monty Irvin, Hank Thompson, and of course, Willie Mays. Horace also combed the Latin and Caribbean markets for talent, but with modest results at first. The really great Latin players, Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, the Alou brothers, etc., they won't make their Giants debut until after the club had arrived in San Francisco. The Giants won National League pennants in 1951 and 1954, and the World Series the latter year, drawing over 1 million patrons each season. But the situation was deteriorating. The North Manhattan neighborhood where the Polo Grounds was situated had become run down. The Polo Grounds themselves were obsolete and in poor repair. And the Giants, the 2 recent pennants notwithstanding, were playing a decided third fiddle to the Yankees and the Dodgers with New York metropolitan area baseball fans. Meanwhile, after 50 years of stability, major league franchises were relocating, with the Boston Braves moving to Milwaukee, the St. Louis Browns to Baltimore, and the Philadelphia A's to Kansas City during the mid-1950s. Unlike modern baseball owners, many of whom make their fortunes elsewhere and own baseball teams as a diversion or a vanity project, Horace Stoneham made his living from the Giants, and he wanted, indeed he needed, a new ballpark for the Giants. The collapse of a project to build a new ballpark on the west side of Manhattan in the late 1950s may well have clinched the Giants' fate. The relocation of the franchise to the West Coast is beyond the scope of this presentation. I assume that Rob Garrett's going to take care of that for you when he comes on. For me, suffice to say that I take Horace at his word when he says he's going to move the club regardless of Walter O'Malley, and that the Giants would have gone to Minneapolis if San Francisco had not materialized. So be it. And that concludes the presentation. Thanks to everyone for listening. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them on.
Bill, fabulous, really. Knowledge is
Terrific.
terrific. I'm going to start off with some questions for you. I know you did the comprehensive piece for SABR. Did you and Rob ever think of publishing a book encompassing the whole ownership? Mars, you gotta. Did you ever think about you and Rob putting together, a book instead of, the SABR piece?
No, we didn't. Our 2 projects sort of evolved separately, and then Rob and I met, I think, the first time at the SABR convention in Houston in 2015, and since that time, we've emailed each other quite regularly on projects of mutual interest. We have a joint interest in Charles Stoneham. He is a fascinating character, and Rob has allowed me to to take a sneak peek at his biography of Stoneman. And I really urge everyone to take a look at it. It's a terrific book about a really fascinating, but now sadly forgotten character and a major player in the history of the Giants. So Rob and I have assisted one another, but not collaborated on a mutual.
Rob will be on to discuss the book when it comes out.
Yeah.
My other question is, was John McGraw, was he generally considered to, I read that he was, in fact, besides the manager, he was the general manager as well. And then other places I saw that Harry Hempstead was the GM. What could you tell us?
At the time, the term general manager was not in use. But traditionally, the manager of the ball club was responsible for procurement of the talent. That evolved over time, but throughout McGraw's time with the Giants from 1902 to 1932, he was effectively general manager without portfolio. Gotcha. Harry Hempstead and McGraw had a distant relationship. McGraw resented the fact that, unlike his father-in-law, John T. Brush, Hempstead did not involve McGraw in decisions about the business side of the Giant affairs, because McGraw had always aspired to a front office position. He wanted to be an executive, not so much a manager, as he grew older. And Hempstead gave no attention to that interest in McGraw. Harry Hempstead took no part in the roster decisions. That was exclusively McGraw's province from the time he took over the Giants in 2002 till the time he retired in 32.
And lastly, the engravement of the Brush stairway, was that after his death? Who decided to do this? And because it went in ill repair, and then maybe 5 years ago they fixed it up. But what's the genesis of that landing?
Well, I'm sort of fuzzy on that. See, at the time, when the Polo Grounds were rebuilt in 1911, it was known as Brush Stadium. The name never caught on. And the stairway which led from the top of Coogan's Bluff down there was a placard put on there somewhere along that staircase that said something about, referred to the Polo Grounds, that's Brush Stadium. So a person taking that staircase would think he was heading to this Brush Stadium that was generally a term that was ignored by the public. That the memory is kind of fuzzy, but it seems to me that thing was restored about 10 or 12 years ago.
Yes.
And renewed interest in the whole situation attended that. I can't say I'm an authority on that, but all I can tell you is that the connection is that brief period of time where the Polo Grounds 4, what I call it, were called, at least by some, Brush Stadium.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go to Mars, Jeff, and then Robert. And then
Put me online.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
no
good.
problem.
First question I have is, you had a sketch of the Polo Grounds in 1911 that showed the bleachers. To my understanding, that wasn't built to the 1930s.
I lifted that. I'm not sure. That's the ballpark that I remember from the 1950s. There were changes made from 1911 through the 1930s, where the foul line changed and a second grandstand was added. More improvements were made to the grounds from 1911 on. So that diagram may not correspond exactly to the way the stadium looked in 1913, but it's a rough approximation.
My second actually statement was in the late 1980s, I worked for the MCI, which broke into the long distance market. And I befriended a co-worker named J.T. Smith. When I went over to his house in Pacifica, California, he showed me a scrapbook, and lo and behold, Frank McQuaid was in the scrapbook. Who is that? He said that's my was either his great uncle or great grandfather. That was very interesting to me, being such a dyed-in-the-wool Giant fan from the New York days, and knowing quite a bit of history about it, which J.T. Smith didn't know. They were in the tool and die business, but it was Judge McQuaid that, as you know, the magistrate that became the partner. So I just want to clue you in on that. Thank you very much.
I'll tell you a little story about Judge McQuaid, who is another of these fascinating characters, now long forgotten, who was involved in the Giants. Judge McQuaid was the magistrate who determined when Chrissy Matheson, manager of the Cincinnati Reds, and John McGraw were arrested for trying to stage a baseball benefit game on a Sunday in 1917 to support the World War I war effort. He decided that, notwithstanding the New York City Blue laws, which dated from the 1660s, that the playing of an exhibition game in support of the war effort did not offend the spirit of the New York City Blue law, and he dismissed the charges. And
Pardon me.
2 years later, he was among the forerunners in the political movement that legalized Sunday baseball in New York in 1919. He's a very interesting and somewhat, shall we say, disreputable, sadly, character.
Jeff, you're up. Unmute. Jeff, you have to unmute.
I can't hear, Gary.
Jeff,
There we
unmute.
go. You got it now? Okay, so from a financial standpoint, at the height of the Stoneham's ownership, when they were still in New York, what was the franchise worth financially? How did it compare to when they left in the winter of '57? And how did it compare overall to Brooklyn at that time?
I'm not a financial analyst. That's beyond my expertise. I can tell you that Stoneham insisted, and I think probably with some degree of justification, that New York was no longer a viable three-city major in 1957. The Giant finances were nowhere near in the same realm as the Yankees, and were not as good, nowhere near as good as the Dodgers. But specific facts and figures is beyond my expertise.
Thank you.
Steve Rothschild.
I just wanted to commend you on the research you did and your presentation. Because like all of us, we knew a lot of this stuff, but there was a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know and learned a lot of new things. So thank you for your presentation. That's all I really wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Robert, you're up.
Pardon me, I'm
Unmute.
online now. Am I online?
Frank, not your turn. Robert, you're
All
up.
right, I'm online. That's what I want.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned that the 1890s was a very turbulent time or 1890s was a very turbulent time for baseball here. But I guess my question is, what impact did the 1893 Depression have on the Giants, or for that matter, baseball in general? Because it had a deep impact in the American economy, though. Were the Giants affected by that deeply?
All teams were affected by that, some more than others. The Panic of 1893 had a devastating effect on the business climate in America, period. At the time, the Giants were in a better financial state than they had been 2 seasons earlier, but not good enough to satisfy the investment expectations of its ownership group, which at the time was the business group of Talcott, McAlpin, Robinson et al., which is why they decided to get out. But the Panic of 1893 had a deleterious impact upon all forms of industry. Remember, baseball is entertainment; it's superfluous, and it involves the expenditure of discretionary income by people. And when money is tight, entertainment is one of the first things to go. So baseball had a lot of problems in the 1890s, but the Panic of 1893 was certainly a significant part of it.
Steve King and then Frank.
Yeah, hi, Bill.
Hi,
Uh,
Steve.
I just, I just wanted to bring up an issue I know you and I have discussed over the years about when Friedman actually sold the team to Brush.
Yes.
And it's worth pointing out that a number of the sports writers, most notably Joe Villa, who was the Giants, the sporting news correspondent covering the Giants, didn't believe that they were sold until about 1910. And there are a lot of things about it. There are a lot of questionable things. One of the things I know in your article you brought up about Jacob Rupert mentioning in the 1930s a newspaper article about that he had tried to buy the Giants. It's also worth noting that in the opening day program of Yankee Stadium in 1923, that he wrote an autobiography, a brief autobiography, and a significant amount of it is how he had tried to buy the Giants in 1902. And it's worth noting that Rupert and Andrew Friedman both were members of Tammany Hall, and they both had the same political rabbi, Richard Coker. So it's a lot of questions about the questioning of why he would have sold to this Ohio Republican, who, as you have mentioned many times, with whom he had had a previously fraught relationship, and yet he wouldn't sell it to Jacob Rupert. And I also should mention it'd be a great, fascinating alternative history if Rupert had bought the Giants, brought Babe Ruth to the Giants, and the Giants ended up being the Yankees instead of the Yankees being the Yankees.
Wishful thinking.
You know, Steve, you and I have had a discussion of this, and it's probably something that's beyond the scope of my presentation today. But I'll say this: I do not subscribe to the Rupert story that he made an offer to Friedman in 1902. When Lyle Spatz and Steve Steinberg asked me about that years ago, they pointed out to an article that Rupert had written in the 1930s, recalling this. But unfortunately, at that time, all the other principals in the matter, John T. Brush, Andrew Friedman, et cetera, they're all long dead. Frank Farrell. I don't subscribe to that. I know that there is that story, but it was one of those that surfaces long after all the principals are dead. And I don't find compelling evidence for it. There's no substantiation for it, but for this Rupert after the fact recollection. So while it has a certain inherent plausibility, I don't find any specific evidence. And as you know, I come from a business where you need evidence to prove things. So I don't subscribe to that theory, even though I know it's a route.
Yeah, the only thing I would mention is about why Rupert, it's just weird that Rupert would take this time here. He's opening the greatest baseball stadium in the country. He has the greatest player on his team. The team is a success. Of why he would take such an extended amount of space to write about this thing that if he was completely making up, that's what bothers me about. And this was a time when there were still people around in 1923.
Right.
So that's just, I know we don't have an answer to it, but that just bothers me about why he would do that. Why it just doesn't make any sense. But
when Lyle and Steve were doing their biography of Rupert, The Colonel and the Hug, which is an excellent book, they queried me about it, and I was in the minority because I didn't buy the story, whereas they had other sources that found it more credible than I did. But I at the risk of being a contrarian, I don't buy it.
Thank you, Steve. Frank, you're up.
First, I want to thank Bill for his presentation and comment. Not the acquittal of those two guys was probably under the doctrine of federal supremacy, that the New York law violated paramount federal supremacy during wartime for what he was doing. Now, are you familiar with the opinion in November versus National Exhibition Company, a lawsuit by a judge that I later came to work for when I served in the New York court system, denying a lawsuit to prevent the Julius November, he was a sports promoter. I don't know exactly what he did. Some of you may. It's in for Harvey Weinberg, if he's listening, since I can't go to law books anymore. It's in volume 10, miscellaneous second. Maybe Harvey can get it out and distribute it to Gary and others. Do you know that he wrote he said, what is sentimentally a four-bagger is legally an out. He cried as he wrote the opinion, saying he didn't have the authority and it wasn't legally proper to prevent the Giants from moving.
I'm not familiar with that, no. I am familiar with some aspects of the events that attended the Giants move, but I can't say I know everything about it, and I'm not familiar with that lawsuit.
Anyway, again, if you have someone that knows how to go to law books, which when my eyes were operational, I could do. November versus National Exhibition Company, Volume 10, miscellaneous second. I forget the page number. Okay.
All I can tell you is that generally speaking, the courts have found that fans, baseball patrons or ticket holders or season subscribers do not have a viable interest in the franchise itself. They have the right to buy a ticket. They don't have a right to say where the games are going to be played or the franchise is going to be located. I mean, litigation is almost a reflexive response to any time a franchise is relocated. And as far as I know, those lawsuits have always gone nowhere.
Thank you, Frank. Mars, go ahead. Unmute.
Sir, how much do you know about the circumstances of the locations that Horace Stoneham vied for in New York, in the New York City area, whether it was, from what I heard, the Bronx side of the Whitestone Bridge, the Hudson River docks, and that Robert Moses turned them down? What do you feel, and how much do you know about the efforts Horace Stoneham put in to try to keep the team in the New York area?
This is, first of all, let me say, I don't know a great deal about it. All I can tell you is that I don't think that Stoneham wanted to move the Giants, but felt that he had no other choice. I think that had a stadium been built on the west side of Manhattan, as was contemplated in the mid-1950s, that the Giants would have stayed, at least in the short term. But absent that, as far as other sites and being turned down by Moses, I know that Walter O'Malley and Moses had their innings. I know very little about Robert Moses being an impediment to the Giants' relocation to a different area of the city. I think the only thing I'm really familiar with is Stoneham's contention that the collapse of the West Side Project is the straw that sent him.
What about New Jersey, exploring New Jersey? O'Malley turned down what became Shea Stadium because he said, who would want to move to the swamps? If Horace Stoneham would have thought about it, he said, well, I'll go there.
That's speculative history. I can tell you this, I never saw a game in Ebbets Field, but in 56 and 57, because my dad wouldn't drive to Brooklyn. We lived in North Jersey. I did see 3 or 4 games in Roosevelt Stadium. The only time I ever saw Jackie Robinson was in 56 at Roosevelt Stadium. I don't know that the Giants had a farm club in Jersey City in the 40s.
Giants, yeah.
Jersey City Giants, but I don't think they ever considered Jersey City a viable option for the major league club.
That might have been a lack of foresight.
I'm a Jersey guy. I live in New Hampshire, but I'm a Jersey guy. But the notion that you can take a New York City team and transplant, I mean, the football Giants and football Jets are great. But putting a team in New York, from New York in New Jersey, and just expect them, they're going to do well or not based upon the talent they put on the field and the interest of the local fan base. And Jersey City had a tough time supporting a minor league club. I don't know how they would have done with a major league club in competition with the Yankees and the Giants as well. It's a who knows.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question for Bill? Bill, I think you were very wise in your decision to split your story into two parts. As hard as it is to come on twice, to rush everything into one, this was so much better. You got good on the computer. We're all very proud of you.
That's my wife.
We
I
just
didn't do
want
anything.
fabulous job with the history of the Giant ownership. Let's all give it up for Bill Lamb.
Thank you, Bill. Very
Thank
nice.
you.
Yep.
And Bill, don't be a stranger here, okay?
Yeah, Gary, I usually watch, I don't know how to Zoom, and I can't ask my wife to do this all the time, but when you send me the link, I watch it the next day.
Perfect. All right, guys. One more thing. This morning, I was invited to a brunch by the San Francisco Giants. Many of you know that Stacy Slaughter was instrumental in bringing the trophy, the trophy tours into Manhattan after the Giants won the World Series, and she was honored today. And some members of the Giants executive team was there, and they asked me to go. So, of course, I went. It was a wonderful morning, and I went representing us. So it was a very lovely affair. Stacy was most deserving. Her secretary Liz was there, and Shayna Daum, who has replaced Stacy as the new person in charge there. Stacy now works directly under Larry Baer. And also there was Alfonso Felder, and Mars would maybe know him. He's in charge basically of the Mission Rock program that is going on in and around Oracle Park. So it's a great day. And the reason probably that we were invited is because we are a definite viable organization in their eyes. So just wanted to pass that on to you. Bill, thank you so much again.
My
And
pleasure, Gary.
I'll hang out here for a while. I know many of you want to get to the Ranger game, but I'll be here for a few minutes.
Bill, where in northern New Jersey were you? Did you live?
Bloomfield,
Bloomfield,
exit 151 for those who don't know.
the Garden State, right?
That's it.
Guys, we will see you next week with Marty Appel. I'm going to stop the recording, and anybody wants to talk Giants, we're here.